How would you describe a secret agent billionaire who routinely travels the world in search of lost treasure, historical artifacts, and mythical secrets while simultaneously defending it from the machinations of menacing miscreants? It depends on when you ask him.
I do not adventure.
I'm looking at a big room of gold that says different.
The life and times of Scrooge McDuck may be filled with countless daring adventures, but that's not always how the richest duck in the world has seen himself. In this DuckTales adventure, we go back to a time when Uncle Scrooge still saw himself as a young Scotsman, making his way in the world through business, being tougher than the toughies, sharper than the sharpies, and earning his fortune by being clever and fair. This is the story about how Scrooge McDuck started to change his perspective, from one of trying to live rich to one of living a rich life.
Donna! Della! Come on now, let's not drag our spats.
Am I Della or Donna? Who cares? To adventure!
Not an adventure.
To business trip!
This is the first adventure. When Disney's new DuckTales series first started, we followed along from the perspective of Huey, Dewey, and Louie, three kids who had heard stories of their great Uncle Scrooge, but had yet to actually meet him. When we did meet Scrooge McDuck, we were joining a life already in progress. But what if the show told that story a little differently? Rather than having us follow along with the triplets, who found themselves invading the life of Scrooge McDuck, what if we followed along with Uncle Scrooge, who suddenly found himself in the care for young relatives he never expected to be the guardian of? Then, you'd have this episode, the first adventure. For fans who have been watching DuckTales from the beginning, it serves as a self-contained flashback. But I like to think of it as an alternative pilot. This story almost could have been the first episode of a series that follows the adventure of a younger Scrooge going on adventures with Della and Donald as children. It's not that. This is absolutely not a backdoor pilot for a series or anything like that at all. But if you were to see this episode in a vacuum, it might look like one. It has all the elements a new show pilot needs. It establishes Scrooge McDuck as the main character, going through his daily life. It quickly introduces two new characters who disrupt his status quo. Within moments, there's a call to adventure, and the new family members who have found their way into Scrooge's life find a way to come along for the ride. And, before all is said and done, Scrooge learns a lesson, grows as a person, and decides that maybe his life will be better with this sudden, new status quo. Everything about this episode is written and structured as an origin story, in a way that's perfect for giving us an endearing glimpse into Scrooge, Della, and Donald's past. Which is actually kind of weird because this episode isn't actually their origin story. It's Bradford's.
So, sir, as you can see, our unpredictable shush escapades are costing us millions.
Bradford Buzzard has been with DuckTales since the beginning. First as an executive on the board of McDuck Enterprises, helping Scrooge run his company, and then as the apparent director of Fowl, the fiendish organization for world larceny. But we don't know much about how he wound up being the leader of an international crime syndicate. And as leader of that syndicate, he's sort of got an interesting perspective on crime.
We're not trying to destroy the world. We're going to steal it. Out from underneath McDuck's nose. Ew. Why was this wet?
Stealing the world is a unique way to think about world domination. It sounds devious, sure, but it doesn't seem evil for evil's sake. And there's a reason for that. It kind of isn't. As this episode opens, we see a young Bradford Buzzard working for Shush. He's an accountant, and he's worried about how much Shush's adventures are costing. He reasons that there might be a more efficient way to rein in the chaos caused by supervillains, and after crunching the numbers, he comes to what seems like the only logical conclusion.
Rather than wait for another villain to threaten the world, why don't we take over the world?
Bradford may be the leader of an organization bent on world domination, but that doesn't necessarily mean he sees himself as evil. He's just someone who vehemently opposes chaos in all its forms. And if he needs to take over the planet in order to rein in that chaos, so be it.
We simply defeat all who oppose us, rein in any unpredictable factors, and efficiently run the world from the shadows with an iron fist. Yes?
Naturally, Shush rejects this idea. It's a little too evil. So Bradford moves forward on his own, founding the fiendish organization for world larceny with Black Heron. And within the first few minutes of the story, the episode establishes that it's about two things: origin and perspective. The next chapter starts when the story jumps forward several decades to meet up with Scrooge McDuck as he suddenly finds himself in the care of a young Della and Donald.
Dear Scrooge, I am sending your angel niece and nephew, Della and Donald, to stay with you while their father is in hospital. A giant firecracker exploded under his chair. The little darlings are so playful.
As I said before, this is very much a new origin story, almost like an alternate universe pilot for a DuckTales series that never happened. But it's more than just an origin story for this era of Uncle Scrooge's life. It's also a reference to several other Duck Adventure origins that came before it. That letter that Scrooge McDuck just read, it's almost a word-for-word echo of the letter Donald Duck receives in the first appearance of Huey, Dewey, and Louie. The entire structure of this episode also echoes the character arcs from the first episode of the 1987 DuckTales, with a business-minded Scrooge McDuck lulled out of his stodgy ways by a new, adventurous family. He even recounts the story of that 1987 pilot and the treasure of the Golden Sons to Della and Donald on their adventure. Along the way, we also see the origins of Della's interest in piloting and Donald's burning rage in defense of his family. But origins aren't all this episode is about. I think more than anything, this is a story about being aware of your perspective in life and how you choose to look at the world. When the episode starts, Scrooge McDuck refuses to call it an adventure. He's a man of business, and he lives a serious life.
My expeditions were grueling, treacherous, and only served to build my company and my fortune. Nothing fun about them.
At the same time, when Beakley, or Director 22, contacts him with a mission to retrieve a magical parchment that creates reality of anything you write on it, Scrooge is clearly excited. Despite insisting all the while that this is an adventure, it's just a very serious expedition. As he quests with his niece and nephew, however, Scrooge finds that he starts to open up. He takes joy in the thrills and successes of his young wars, and it doesn't take long before he starts trusting them to help him reach his goal. And eventually, Scrooge is forced to decide how he really wants to look at the world. When Black Heron gets a hold of that reality-altering parchment, she tries to doom Donald and Della with a command that would see Scrooge McDuck's sidekicks perish on his mission. There's only one problem with that wish.
They're not my sidekicks, you degenerate egret. They're my family. Gross. And this is no mission, it's an adventure.
In a lot of ways, this is the same lesson that Scrooge learned in the first episode of the new DuckTales series. Life is better as an adventure, and family really is the greatest adventure of all time. In practice, there may not be a very big difference between an expedition and an adventure, but an intentionally different attitude and perspective can make all the difference. Simply by looking at life differently, Scrooge goes from prioritizing running a corporate empire to focusing on living a life well lived with people he cares about. And that's enough to completely change his worldview on how he should live his life.
I need to hand off my day-to-day business duties. That way, I can spend more time adventuring with my heirs. We'll find that papyrus someday.
Yeah, we will! Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy!
But to talk about where that's leading, we need to talk about something I skipped over. Black Heron wasn't the only adversary in Scrooge's first adventure with Donald and Della. Bradford Buzzard was there too, and he eventually had to use the power of the parchment to erase his part in that adventure from the minds of the Duck family. Which is how Bradford is able to step in as the person Scrooge hands his business duties off to at the end of the episode.
As you may know, my business can be a tad chaotic.
I have noticed, sir, and I assure you, I will rein in that chaos.
Good.
This is exactly where Bradford wants to be, and where he is when we meet him back at the beginning of the new DuckTales series. Back in Season 1, he's a methodical pencil pusher with a mind for order, even if building that order takes years of subterfuge to achieve. And while that doesn't sound like the actions of a good guy, it's important to remember that it's all about perspective. Bradford may be Scrooge's secret nemesis throughout all the years, but he certainly doesn't see himself as the villain.
This is not outlandish supervillainy. This is order.
From Bradford's perspective, Scrooge is the villain. His adventures see him facing off against powerful sorceresses like Magica de Spell, or fending off an alien invasion from General Lunaris and the armies of the moon. Scrooge attracts trouble, chaos that puts the world at risk. And the only way Bradford can think to protect the world is to take control of it, to keep people like Scrooge from putting it in danger. Unfortunately for Bradford, achieving that goal means aligning himself with even more chaos, the likes of Black Heron, Steelbeak, the Phantom Blot, and more. This makes Bradford a really interesting villain, because it shows that although his actions are harmful, he's trying to think about the greater good. That doesn't make him right, and it doesn't make him good, but it does make him complex. He's still the antagonist of this series, and absolutely the bad guy. But I like his character arc because it shows that he doesn't have to be the bad guy. Bradford wants to take over the world to protect it, and right now that makes him evil. But he may one day realize that his ambition has aligned him with agents more chaotic than the ones he's trying to protect the world from. At some point in the future, Bradford may have to choose the kind of chaos he's willing to tolerate. The chaos of Scrooge McDuck and his adventures, or the chaos created by the other members of Fowl. And I'm really excited to see how that turns out. There were a lot of other amazing things in this episode I didn't have time to touch on. Like how Yellowbeak the pirate is actually a reference to one of the first Carl Barks adventure stories, and how Scrooge jumps over the gorge using a DuckTales video game style pogo cane, or that young Donald has a new voice to replace the late Rusty Taylor, and the voice is pretty good. All in all though, this is a pretty fun episode, and it's completely packed with new story elements and a ton of references. What did you think of this story? And do you think it's setting up the opportunity for Bradford Buzzard to turn good? I kind of do, but even if it isn't, I still like it for being so well self-contained. It basically stands on its own, almost like a pilot for a new series, even though it isn't one. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos as this season finishes early next year. Until next time, thanks for watching. Take it easy, Internet.